Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for taking a part of your Saturday afternoon to be with us. My name is Dan KROOP, and I'm pleased to chair today's panel discussion and audience question and answer session today as we look at the cancel rent movement the title of the event, Can't Pay, Won't Pay. I'm also proud to be a part of Rent Strike 2020, which is a nationwide activist organization working to build the mutual aid community and working class power during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm also part of the Housing Justice for All movement in New York, which surged to prominence with last June's historic rent laws victory. It's very exciting to have some of the leaders of that campaign on our panel this afternoon talking about the rent strike movement. Today, New York's housing justice movement provides a crucial defense in what has become a two-front war. On one front, against the health hazards of a global pandemic, where in the United States, New York quickly became the center of that outbreak. And the other front, of course, the economic fallout of what appears to be a new Great Depression. Has it ever been clearer that housing is a human right and that housing is healthcare? Over 36 million Americans have lost their jobs since the start of the pandemic, and more than 2 million of those are in New York State. Most of these 2 million are renters. But by the start of May, more than 67 buildings throughout New York, 1,000 tenants, and 14,000 tenants who signed a pledge not to pay rent in May. Add this to the hundreds of thousands of Housing Justice for All members and petition signers, to the hundreds of thousands of Rent Strike 2020 petition signers in New York State, and it's clear our movement is engaged in the largest rent strike in New York history. Yet, as we will hear today, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has given out half measures at best and no real way forward. And that's why New Yorkers are demanding to cancel rent now. A little bit of housekeeping about how today's event will work. This event is being streamed on both Facebook Live and YouTube, and I hope all of the technical elements are working well for you there, but feel free to flip between the two if something doesn't seem to be going right. You can also leave a comment there. Those are being monitored by folks from our organizations just to make sure the technical side is working well. You're also welcome to write comments, and please do send questions and share resources for other rent strikers in the chats. Those will be an important way that we can connect in live real time as part of this event. In terms of structure, the panel will speak first. The first 4 panelists will have around 8 minutes each, and the last 2 panelists around 5 minutes each. And our panelists today include Sia Weaver. She's the lead organizer from the Housing Justice for All Coalition. Stephen Latham, who's a tenant organizer and a member of Socialist Alternative. Andrea Shapiro, who's the director of programs and advocacy at the Metropolitan Council on Housing. MARCELA MITAYNES, who's the DSA candidate for New York Assembly in Brooklyn. She's also a tenant organizer. Ellen Miller, who's part of the full-time tenants union, Rent Strike 2020, and also a tenant organizer. And Lena Melendez, who is a tenant organizer with Riverside Edgecombe Neighborhood Association, and she is on rent strike as well in Washington Heights. So we really span, New York here, coming from a lot of different perspectives. And as I said, we'll have moderators who are experienced in the housing, the homelessness movements, who will be reviewing your comments in the discussion. And they are going to help filter the best, most widely applicable questions up for our panel, our expert panel, to speak to after they have the chance to introduce with some comments themselves. So in general, we're hoping that you'll take 3 things out of today's meeting. First, to connect more deeply into this housing movement and some of the organizations who are doing so much work on the ground. Second, to think critically about what strategy is best. What is the way? What are the strategies and tactics and political orientation we need to arm ourselves with to take this rent strike, to take the cancel rent and the housing justice movements forward? And finally, also know that our speakers are here to share, references, to share resources and calls to action throughout this afternoon, so that we can make this really a chance for us to come together and strengthen our movement and put it on a firmer foundation going forward. Just to wrap up, COVID-19 is obviously very, very scary, and the death toll is heartbreaking. But COVID-19 also invites us to imagine a different world. The novelist and social critic Arundhati Roy described pandemics as, quote, a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. With that, I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker. Stephen Latham is a tenant organizer and a member of Socialist Alternative New York City. Socialist Alternative NYC is the citywide organization of Socialist Alternative, which is the party of three-term Seattle City Council member Shama Sawant, who's the country's longest-serving independent socialist Marxist elected official. Socialist Alternative is a membership organization, and it's in political solidarity with International Socialist Alternative, which is active in over 30 countries around the globe. You can join or learn more at socialistalternative.org. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Stephen Latham, who is going to talk first on the panel. Thank you again so much, and we hope you enjoy this afternoon's event. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Dan, and hello to everyone. Thank you to the panelists here as well. I honestly feel really excited and humbled and proud to speak alongside everybody and to be organizing with some people for the first time and some of the other people present yet again. As a member of Socialist Alternative and a resident of Inwood a few years ago, the campaign to stop the corporate rezoning plans in Inwood, working with Northern Manhattan is not for sale, was honestly one of the most transformational events in my political development and brought me very close to the community and the activists there, like Andrea and Lena, who are joining us today. Today, I'm a resident of North Brooklyn and a worker in the hospitality and service industries. Like many people, I was recently laid off. The small business that I work for has unfortunately used this crisis to make cuts. And now myself and the staff of the restaurant where I work have been told that most of us will not be getting our jobs back. I too don't know how I will be able to pay rent when the current moratorium is lifted. This current crisis around rent and all of the other awful effects that this pandemic has had on individuals and society as a whole would be minimized or even non-existent if we lived in a world that wasn't rotting from inequality and environmental destruction, thanks to the for-profit system of capitalism. So what I wanted to do today was highlight the role of socialists and the socialist movement in this moment and also in the historical record. Socialists have a dual task. We support and amplify the struggles of workers and communities everywhere for justice, but we also aim to link these struggles together to build a broader movement for the socialist transformation of society. We amplify, but we also broaden. But also, we're not just like outside participants. We're also workers and tenants ourselves. We're in a moment globally of renewed struggle and fight back against inequality, as evidenced by the immense popularity around Bernie Sanders and also a labor movement that has been fighting to be reborn, evidenced through the wave of teacher strikes in the last few years. All of these struggles are flowing from the growing inequality in society, in which billionaire corporations are given massive tax breaks and trillion-dollar bailout packages, while workers like us are thrown the scraps, such as the totally inadequate $1,200 checks that we all got, which don't even cover rent for a one-bedroom in most cities in America. But also, these struggles are flowing from the absolute failure of the corporatized Democratic Party establishment to mount a real resistance to the Trump administration. In fact, they nominate their own racist and sexist pro-business candidates as a sort of compromise with the far right, while doing everything in their power to block working class movements, because they are more interested in protecting their big business donors and the billionaire class generally than they are in helping the poor and the most oppressed. We see this locally in New York too. In the midst of this health crisis and the greatest economic depression since the 1930s, Governor Cuomo and Democrats in the state House and Assembly have just passed a severe austerity budget for New York State, which includes cuts to the healthcare system. And these are going to put an even deeper strain on working people in the coming months and years. Now, understandably, some people with very good intentions in the progressive and even the socialist movement have made it their mission to attempt to reform the Democratic Party and to use their ballot line to win some significant, though ultimately modest, reforms for working people. SA is totally sympathetic to this, and we support every reform that can be won to ease the strain on working people. But we also think that this is a losing strategy in the longer term. In order to actually reform the Democratic Party, the absolute minimum that would be required would be structurally removing all corporate money from their campaigns, adopting a consistent and democratically decided upon pro-worker platform, transforming it into a membership-structured, dues-paying organization with the powers to recall any candidate or legislator who doesn't follow that party platform. Now, these four things are something that the Democratic Party establishment will never allow to happen, no matter how many progressives are elected. That's why, instead, SA thinks that we need to begin building now for a new party of the 99% that would be composed of activists and working people from social and economic justice movements. Concrete steps at the local and state level can be made toward making this a viable possibility right now. Our organization is already doing this in Seattle, where our member Shama Sawant has been elected 3 times to the Seattle City Council as an open socialist representative, totally independent of the Democratic Party. Through our council office there, we have been able to organize mass pressure campaigns to win important victories, such as the very first $15 minimum wage in the country. We have also been organizing and fighting through our council office to tax Amazon and big business to fund public and affordable housing and to provide relief to working people during this pandemic. And yet, the progressive Democrats in that city continue to block these efforts, and they continue to prop up the Chamber of Commerce and big business. SA believes that with the organizing tools and capacity of a new party, we could actually begin to amplify struggles such as for the cancellation of rent during the pandemic, and then take it forward to new, more robust victories. For example, by demanding universal rent control and a permanent freeze on rent hikes. We would then continue to build that ladder that would transition us toward massive investment funded by taxing big business to win public housing and a great public works project linked up with a workers' Green New Deal to transition us away from fossil fuels. We argue for housing the homeless as well by using the eminent domain laws to use all the luxury apartments and investment properties that sit vacant year-round for this very purpose. We also propose that we should take the largest 50 landlords in the country, the ones who are making hundreds of millions of dollars off of this current health crisis, into democratic public ownership. And we shouldn't stop there. We should take the largest banks and polluters and companies like Amazon and the for-profit drug companies and hospitals, all of these things into public ownership so that they no longer have the capacity to gamble with our futures and our lives. These companies should be run by the workers themselves. Socialist Alternative has been active internationally in these kind of struggles for many decades now, and we have been able to win some very important victories, such as the abolition of charges for water usage in Ireland. We also played a key role in the Occupy Homes movement in Minneapolis, where, yet again, the Democrats in that city backed military-style raids to evict tenants. But we helped to organize hundreds of tenants to pack out eviction hearings, and we led mass marches directly into police lines, eventually securing the homes for dozens of tenants through collective action. We also used this moment to run our own candidate, Ty Moore, for city council there to help politicize this process. Our slogan during these fights has often been that it is better to break the law than to break the poor. And this is very similar to today's slogan for rent cancellation. Can't pay? Won't pay. Underlying these slogans is the need for direct action taken by a mass movement of working people. If the landlords and the bosses are going to continue to exploit and take advantage of us, well, then we'll just have to turn it around on them and refuse to pay until we get what we want and deserve. But as you're going to hear today from other panelists, To do this effectively, we have to get organized at the building and neighborhood levels, but also to do it in a way that won't then be stripped away from us at the soonest opportunity. We have to have the largest possible politicized movement that must therefore be linked up to other similar movements rather than be isolated and atomized. So, in addition to supporting and amplifying the rent strike movement, we think that building a political party of the working class and poor and strengthening our socialist movement is the best space in and through which these various struggles can be linked to a broader movement for justice. And that's why we would urge you to consider joining SA and our movement during this crisis. As you make your plans now to stand with other tenants during this rent strike and amplify their struggles, let's also think about broadening out. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's really interesting to hear sort of this immediate question of rent cancellation and investment in affordable housing linked to these broader political questions of strategy of the Democratic Party and so on. So thank you for that. And I also think, one thing that was raised is really our own working class history as being a guide. And I think in New York, rent strikes from the beginning of the 20th century to the 30s to the 60s are part of the fabric of New York history in a really important way. And there's so much to learn from reviewing the successes and the failures of the movements that came before us. And with that, I'd like to turn to our next speaker, Sia Weaver. Sia Weaver is the lead organizer of the Housing Justice for All Coalition, which has brought together both upstate and downstate renters and folks like that. It's a coalition of New York tenant unions, renter advocacy groups, socialist organizations, and many, many others that has really made our state's housing movement so vibrant and successful in the past number of years. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sia Weaver.
Okay, let me get myself off of mute. Hey folks, thank you so much for having me today. Like Daniel said, I'm the campaign coordinator of the Housing Justice for All Coalition, which includes many organizations across the state, including Met Council on Housing and RENA, and a lot of the folks who are represented on this call today have been really active in Housing Justice for All. So I don't want to take up too much space, and the people that you're going to hear from are people who are real experts on the work that Housing Justice for All is doing. I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about what our demands are in this COVID-19 moment. COVID-19 has revealed what many of us in the housing justice movement have known for years, and this the thing that we've been saying for a decade at least. Everyone is just one paycheck away from an eviction. Whether you feel that way or not, our housing as renters is so precarious because we have a system of public policy that is set up to prioritize homeowners over renters, and that has left people who rent their homes living really as second-class citizens. We've been saying that everyone is one life event, a medical emergency, a loss of a family member, a loss of a job, away from an eviction. And what happened on March 15th when the economy shut down is that life event happened to everybody, many people all at the same time, right? So that meant that millions of New Yorkers have lost their income. Millions of New Yorkers cannot pay their rent anymore and are living in apartments that were already unaffordable, but now are extremely even more unaffordable than they were before. So what does that mean? That means that even if the economy were to reopen tomorrow, our jobs are not coming back. It means that we have a massive housing crisis on our hands as our economy enters a period of sustained unemployment. And I know that Marcela and Lena are going to talk a little bit more about that and what some solutions are. I'm going to talk a little bit about our demands and how our demands fit into this larger frame of fighting back against the real estate industry, their control on our economy, and the role that people can play in fighting to cancel rent. So what we are doing is we are fighting as Housing Justice for All, and I'm just going to put, actually I can't put in the chat, but I can try and share on the Facebook for the live stream, www.housingjusticeforall.org. That's our website. And on that website, you can navigate to a COVID-19 page, and all of these demands are listed there. So I know that I tend to talk a little bit fast, and sometimes it's easier to digest things in writing. So please do check out our website. I'll just put it in the chat so someone can post it on the Facebook. It's www.housingjusticeforall.org/COVID-19, and all of the stuff that you're looking for is there. So we are fighting to cancel rent and reclaim our homes. So what does that mean? That means that all housing costs, rents, mortgages, utilities should be canceled or forgiven for the duration of the COVID-19 crisis, universally and automatically. And that cancellation must be paired with a permanent and a long-term investment in social housing and expanding the universe of municipally owned housing and housing that is run not for profit. So really similar to what Stephen was talking about earlier. A strong cancel rent and reclaim our homes policy would do three things. It would universally cancel housing payments. We don't believe that anyone should have to prove in this moment that they lost income. The people for whom this crisis is falling upon the most are people who work in the gig economy, undocumented immigrants, people who work in the cash economy, people who have gotten sick, who didn't actually get laid off, right? So like having to prove that you got laid off to be eligible for unemployment means that people who actually got COVID can't get helped. So that's why we're fighting for a universal rent cancellation where you actually don't have to prove any loss of income in order to be eligible for the benefit. At the same time, we want to create a small landlord hardship fund. We believe that cancel rent is the only policy that doesn't treat landlords equally, right? Like if you have a mom and pop landlord who lives on your first floor, like I do, I believe that, we are fighting to make sure that that renter or that landlord has the ability to stabilize their property, right? Housing does cost money to operate housing, and that landlords should be able to get money from the government to operate housing as opposed to money from renters to operate housing, right? But that money shouldn't be going to profit. So that means that every dollar that comes into the landlord's pockets needs to come with some conditions around tenants' rights and around living conditions. So we are fighting to universally cancel rent. We are fighting for the government to make sure that the operation of housing is working, but we are not fighting for the government to subsidize profits of landlords. And finally, we are fighting to prevent a corporate landlord buy-up of properties. So one of the things that's happening right now is that millions of New Yorkers simply cannot pay the rent because they've lost their jobs. Private equity companies are waiting in the wings, right? Because if I can't pay my rent to my landlord, Andrea, who works as a teacher, Andrea is which Andrea doesn't do, by the way, this is a hypothetical. Say Andrea is my landlord, no offense, Andrea. It's not a pejorative. If I can't pay my rent to Andrea and Andrea can't collect rent from any of us and she's a teacher and she can't maintain her building, what she's gonna do is she's gonna sell her building to Blackstone. Because Blackstone is waiting in the wings. Blackstone is literally walking around our neighborhood saying I'll take that off your hands. I can sustain waiting for 4 or 5 months or 10 months without rent, right? So a strong cancel rent policy needs to prevent a corporate buy-up of properties by giving renters the first opportunity to intervene in any sale, and giving the city or the state the first opportunity to intervene in any sale. So landlords shouldn't have the opportunity to sell to Blackstone directly. There should be an opportunity for the city or the state or the renters themselves to intervene in this process and to collectivize thousands and thousands of units of housing in this moment as millions of people can't pay rent. So that's what a strong cancel rent policy means to us. It means universal cancellation of rents. It means protecting the operation of housing, but not the private profit of individuals or corporations. And it means preventing private equity companies from taking over whole neighborhoods the way that they did in 2008 and 2009 and 2010. The last thing I'm going to talk about is why vouchers and rent supplements, which are the commonly thought about idea for this crisis, are not enough. So a voucher or a rent supplement, which is generally understood as it feels good, right? It's generally vouchers may sound nice in theory, right? A voucher means that the government is going to pay me, the individual, to pay my rent. The reality is that vouchers subsidize the real estate industry. The reality is that the reality is that for many, many years, the real estate industry has been saying that we want to raise rents as much as we possibly can, and we want the government to subsidize that, right? So vouchers individualize the housing market. They sound nice in theory, but they are difficult to apply for. They are difficult to get access to. They are generally not accessible to undocumented communities, and rent subsidies that target themselves to an individual are based on a long history of racial discrimination and exclusion. They have been used as a mechanism to divest from public housing and invest in like housing choice, a framework that has been characterized by segregation and discrimination. They transfer public wealth to private players and allow the real estate industry to basically hold the government hostage by raising the rent as much as they possibly can. And they don't come with any rental protections as well. So aside from not working well, not reaching the people who really need them, and being like extremely expensive and subsidizing the private profit of the real estate industry. Well, I guess those are the main things. But they also disempower our movement because it's continuing on this path of housing being seen as like an individual good and not as something that we all collectively need. So we are fighting against rent subsidies and direct subsidies to individuals, and in favor of subsidies to the operation of buildings and treating housing as a good that we share, as opposed to something that like people deserve, that people like can get if they deserve it. They meet certain characteristics, or they're able to pay for it themselves. So the last thing that I will say is that while we don't believe as vouchers is the long-term solution, we do know that in the short to medium term, there are many, many homeless New Yorkers in our state, and 92,000 people are homeless, and that for some people, we need to get folks housed as quickly as possible. So when we do talk about rent support, we're talking about using rent support to rehab apartments that are being warehoused to house the homeless, and to fund the operation of social housing, like public housing or housing that's run not for profit, with a priority to house homeless individuals. So I think that is the lay of the land. I will say that vouchers are the primary option on the table right now. And in order to move from this individual landlord bailout to a shared solution that works for all of us, it's going to take all of us to fight. So we do need all of you to join us in the fight. And so I'm just going to post a link in the chat that hopefully someone can share on the Facebook. This is our petition to Governor Cuomo to cancel the rent. It is bit.ly no rent NY. So please do sign that petition to the governor to cancel the rent. We can do this. There's an option on the table at the federal level. Ilhan Omar has a bill that would cancel rent universally and expand access to social housing. We do think that we can do this through government action directly from the governor in New York. So this is possible. Don't let anyone tell you it's not possible. It is totally possible, and we are building a movement to win it, and you can join us if you sign this petition. And if you can't pay the rent, please sign there. We have sort of two tracks of organizing going on: folks who want to like act in solidarity, and folks who like literally can't pay the rent and don't know what to do. So if you are in that second category where like you can't pay the rent, you don't know what to do, and you want to be part of this movement with millions of other people like you who also can't pay the rent, because you are not alone. It's not your fault if you can't pay the rent. Please do sign this Can't Pay May pledge. I know it's not May anymore, but it's still June and we still can't pay the rent. So thank you so much. I'll get out of the way now, and I really hope that y'all join the Can't Pay May movement.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Sia. I think that really touched on so many elements of really important pieces of what the state of play is now, what the options are, and it's really important to note that SIA really played a historic role in the rent laws that were passed last June. It's hard to believe that was not even a full year ago that those rent law victories were etched, and now there's another titanic struggle ahead of the housing justice movement, and it's linked to the role of the working class as a whole. I really appreciated how Sia talked about hedge funds and investors trying to gobble up, the smaller landlords or whatever buildings that they can, and pointed to the capitalist system and the ways that there's just such mass inequality now, and we'll see that reflected in the housing system unless there's a universal response and one that recognizes housing as a human right, as Sia said. So with that, I want to move on to our next speaker, Andrea Shapiro. Andrea Shapiro is the Director of Programs and Advocacy at the Met Council on Housing, or a long-standing nonprofit with also an activist arm. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrea to speak right now. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us on this beautiful Saturday. And so, Met Council is New York's oldest tenant union, citywide tenant union. We've been fighting neglectful landlords and politicians since 1959, which means that we've been doing this for a little over 60 years at this point. And what Met Council does is we believe that by organizing tenants and coming together through mutual aid, we can end the affordability crisis and decommodify housing in this generation. And one of the important things to think about in the housing movement, as Dan just pointed out and Sia mentioned, is that the housing movement has done amazing things in the past. That we've been able to get rent stabilization and rent control. We've been able to even just get laws around housing court, and huge victories in the last year, which we were told were impossible. That any deregulation, that stopping the flood of housing leaving the rent stabilized system and regulatory system was impossible. And we were able to do that through coming together, through organizing our buildings, and then going to Albany. Unfortunately, this year we can't go to Albany, or we can't anymore go to Albany. And so we are using a very long-standing New York tradition of going on rent strike. And what's sort of amazing about the New York housing movement is that this isn't our first rent strike that's been citywide. There have been rent strikes starting in the beginning of the housing movement in the early 1900s, the 1930s, 1960s, and 1970s. So we are picking up on a very old tradition, which has made big changes. In fact, the reason why we have the first housing laws in New York is because of the women who went on rent strike in the early 1900s. And they did something very similar to us. Often when we think about rent strikes, we think about conditions, we think about sort of an entire building going on rent strike because they don't have heat, because they need a lot of repairs. This is very simply, we can't pay and we're not going to pay. We need large action from the government and from our landlords to cancel our rent. And so we are reaching back in our traditions to those movements to go on rent strike around not being able to afford our rent. And we're doing this with our neighbors. And it's really important that we do this together for both security, as well as to make sure that Governor Cuomo can actually hear what's happening. And as Dan mentioned in the beginning, we have over 67 buildings that Housing Just for All groups are working with, thousands of tenants that are going on rent strike. And there's a lot that needs to happen to do this. Rent strike is more than just not paying your rent. It's a political action to make sure that our government actually hears us and that our landlords are feeling the pain while we are too. There's no tenant right now who should have to choose between food and rent. That's an unconscionable choice. And the fact that many landlords are trying to convince us that we need to pay rent first is horrible. And so when we talk about rent strike, we're talking about talking with people in your building, which is a scary thing to do right now. It's always scary to knock on someone else's door, but especially now when we're told not to go too near each other. And so some of the things we're suggesting are to put notes under people's doors, to put up signs in common areas, and to talk with each other. As buildings, we're in a unique position where we're able to actually support each other in this time. when many of us aren't able to reach out to family members or other people we know in the neighborhood, we're already in these units of apartment buildings. And many groups have already come together to form mutual aid pods to help get food to each other, medicine to each other, and also provide some social interactions, which a lot of people are missing at this time, especially if there are seniors in your building. Once you come together in some format you can have a Facebook group, text chat, Zoom meeting, it's really good to ask, like, who can't pay rent? And it's really important that tenants don't feel alone. There are literally millions of people who are on the verge of not paying rent, and tens of thousands of people who can't pay rent right now. And often we feel a lot of shame around not being able to pay our rent, being late on rent payments. But you didn't do anything to cause this crisis. The housing crisis and rent affordability was caused by landlords and our government listening to landlords. And the COVID-19 crisis was caused by a pandemic, not by the fact that you lost your job. Your job is a side effect of the pandemic. And we need the government to act because of that reason. And once you come together as a group, know who can't pay rent, we're then asking people in that building with solidarity to come with those tenants. And that provides security to tenants who are very vulnerable. Because as we know, the most vulnerable tenants are the people who also can't pay rent right now. Many of them lost their jobs in the cash economy. So people who work in service industries, in restaurants, in bars, people who clean houses, our nannies, home care workers, are having problems paying rent, are most vulnerable to landlord harassment. And your landlord is going to harass you. Your landlord is going to pull on your heartstrings. I know my landlord tried to, telling me how great landlords they were, making sure that I knew how many buildings. They had a small number of buildings. Turns out they have 25. It's not so small, right? They'll pull on your heartstrings. If not, they might actually say things to harass you, to warn you that they're going to evict you. They might change your locks. They're going to turn off heat and electricity. And they're not allowed to do that. Your landlord is not allowed to evict you in New York State without bringing you to court. The courts are open to deal with these cases, and there has been an uptick. And so it's really important that you don't give in to your landlord's harassment. You don't talk to your landlord. Right? You have no reason to talk to your landlord right now after you tell them that you're on rent strike. Don't answer their phone calls. They come to the door, don't answer the door. They're not allowed into your apartment while you're living there. And we remind each other about that because it's really scary when your landlord's offering you a deal, saying, I can evict you. I'm going to make your life miserable. You're never getting an apartment again. That you're not alone. That there are going to be thousands of people who need to look for apartments after this if we don't win. And the scale of this is almost unimaginable. Something that we would never have thought about in the past, of thousands, tens of thousands of people not paying rent and being brought to housing court at once. And so remember that you're with other people and don't talk to your landlord. Don't take a side deal. A lot of landlords are telling tenants associations, talk with me, don't talk with the tenant association. You're not going to get a better deal from your landlord than what you can now. If you can pay rent, it's a wise idea to hold on to that rent. So if you're doing this in solidarity, put the money aside, make sure you have it, is always a wise idea. And make sure that when you're doing things in solidarity, you're actually in solidarity with people, that you're talking with the tenants in your building who can't pay, and you're acting together. We're asking people to put up signs in their windows and on their buildings that say cancel rent to show the neighborhood that you can't pay rent. It means a lot when you can see other buildings with signs, with banners up, that you're not alone, especially when we can't gather in large protests and rallies. We had a beautiful day on May 1st. Even the Queensboro Bridge got into the cancel rent action. And we're doing another day like this on May 22nd. We're asking folks to put up banners, put up signs in their windows. It can be a simple homemade on the back of a flyer. Cancel rent. Put it in your window. Show your neighbors that you're with them and show the people on your block that you're with them. And then call your legislators, post it online, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter, on all the ways that you share photos that we need to cancel rent and that you're part of the movement, because we really need our elected officials to see the problem. It's very easy for them to ignore the problem right now. They know theoretically people aren't paying rent. They know the unemployment numbers, but right now we're all just numbers. And they think that, as Sia mentioned, they can give us a few vouchers and we'll be fine. They do not understand who's actually being affected by this crisis. And they can't see the faces, they can't hear the stories. And so we need to make them hear. And we need to do that by sharing our photos, sharing our stories, being public, which is very scary. And we need to make sure that they can see that by posting it, by sharing it, and by talking with each other and staying strong together.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrea. And I think one thing that just stood out in those remarks is, right, 25 buildings, the concept of that being like a small landlord. And we're going to get into that. There was a great question in the comments from Michelle Rafferty. She asked, what is considered a small landlord, and how the movement and the demands of the broader Housing Justice for All coalition include cancellation. It includes dealing with these issues for small landlords. And we're going to get into that when we get into the question and answer, but I wanted to react to that a little bit. I also think that idea about the May 22nd actions of banners and signs to be visual, those questions about how we overcome the challenges of social distancing and organizing in the age of social distancing, which is new for everybody, those will be important questions we take up as well in the questions and answers. So our next panelist, I'd like to introduce, her name is MARCELA MITAYNES, and she is a DSA candidate, Democratic Socialists of America, DSA candidate for New York State Assembly in Brooklyn. She's also a tenant organizer, and we're really glad to have her on today's event. So with that, over to you, Marcela.
Hi, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. Thanks for everyone who's joining us. My name is MARCELA MITAYNES, and I'm an immigrant from Peru. I moved to Sunset Park at the age of 5, and in 2006, I got a landlord, and within 6 months, he was able to displace half of the 35-unit rent-stabilized apartment that I lived in. I ended up losing my housing. I didn't understand what was happening, but was able to connect with a community organization called Neighbors Helping Neighbors in Sunset Park, where I learned that this was an isolated situation, that I met neighbors that were facing similar housing insecurities. And, we decided that we wanted to work together and start making changes, and really got involved in the tenant movement a little over 10 years ago. It's been an amazing experience talking and meeting new folks from across the state. But I think it's also really important to understand that we build a movement, not only that saw us bring historic rent laws in June of 2019, but we landed a devastating blow to the real estate industry. And so I think that's really important to understand what our collective power was able to accomplish. And we all knew that our fight wasn't over, that even though we were very successful with the historic rent laws that passed, that there was still a lot of work to do, and a lot of tenants that were suffering, and a lot of tenants that needed relief. And so I think that we are in a unique opportunity to really understand what's happening. So we've already got a base, and our folks are, suffering. We're hearing about the job losses, the health issues that folks have. The truth is, there just really isn't any income coming in. And it's unfathomable to think of how we're supposed to pay for something when we have none. So I think this brings us to a really big opportunity to bring additional folks into the tenant movement, but even folks that don't even consider themselves part of this group, or part of this movement. We know that there's tenants out there that are just making the difficult decision of not paying rent and not realizing that they are actually participating in a rent strike. So making sure that we're talking to each other, making sure we're supporting each other, making sure that we understand the ask, right? We understand that this system that existed before this pandemic was inadequate, we have the opportunity to build the grassroots power that we need to dismantle this system the way that we know it and rebuild it. And what better opportunity than have the people most impacted to be leading the charge and making the decisions about what changes need to be made. You know, in my district, particularly the neighborhood of Sunset Park where I grew up, it's predominantly monolingual Spanish speakers that I work with. I'm currently, we're struggling to figure out ways to transition the face-to-face meetings that we had onto, you know, other technological issues that we're facing. It's been really difficult, but at the same time, there's also such a need and a desire for more information and to understand what's happening. You know, just around the end of April and right after the 1st, I was getting random calls from tenants in the neighborhood who are asking questions. So this stuff is in the news and we're starting to talk about it, but we need to change the narrative and make sure that we are pushing the points that we know are going to make a difference to our folks. To just a little bit of a broader picture and to talk about the corporate landlords that we're dealing with, it's important to have these conversations so folks understand what it really means and what specifically we're asking, the range of things that we're asking under this cancel rent thing, and how that is really going to start if we're able to achieve that, the changes that we're going to be able to make, and making sure that we are working toward the belief that housing is a human right. But on the waterfront, we're having a rezoning, and it's a private developer who took out a $647 million loan in 2017 to upzone our waterfront, a little over 1 million square feet. We have built a resistance and are fighting really hard, but it's difficult. And one of the things that we just learned is that Blackstone just led a $720 million refinance packaging loan for that rezoning that they're trying to do. So understanding that this is exactly what we're concerned about, and the vultures are already, they're already smelling the blood. And so it's really important to understand what's at stake. It's important to understand that we do have the power as individuals, and the collective power that we have yet to wield. And it's important now more than ever that we organize and that we fight for our homes. At the end of the day, this is about money and folks that are losing their profits. They're not losing their shelter, they're not losing their homes, they're not losing food, but we are. And making sure that we are taken care of as part of this, part of these relief packages, and part of like really making sure that our communities get back on their feet.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Marcela. I just want to make sure that that was the end. That was really great. Thank you. And again, that was Marcela MITAYNES. She's a DSA candidate for New York State Assembly in Brooklyn. You can check out her website as well as the platform of a number of other Democratic Socialists who are running for office across New York State, as well as how to volunteer. So to keep things moving, as we get closer, we just have 2 more speakers who are both rent strikers. And know firsthand what this experience is like, and are going to talk about organizing, best practices, how to do this, how to build outward as well from your building that you live in, and how our housing justice movement can gain strength. So with that, our next speaker is Ellen Miller. Ellen is part of Full-Time Tenants Union. That is Full-Time Management is the name of the management company there. So Full-Time Tenants Union. She's part of Rent Strike 2020. She's a rent striker and a tenant organizer. Really glad to have these next 2 speakers as well. So over to you, Ellen.
Thanks, Dan. And thank you to everyone who's spoken so far, and to everybody who's watching. As Dan said, my name is Ellen. I'm a renter in Bushwick, and I am rent striking in solidarity with those who can't pay rent. And I'm also organizing with Full-Time Tenant Union, which is a group of tenant associations and renters under our same landlord, Full-Time Management. So in contrast to the sort of mom and pop landlords that Sia had mentioned, Full-Time Management owns 140 buildings in New York City, which means that every month they're collecting rent from hundreds, many hundreds, if not thousands of tenants. And large landlords like this are really the sort of embodiment of the for-profit rental market. And against a landlord of this scale, one tenant alone has very little power. When one of us can't keep the money flowing in, it's very easy for us to be basically evicted and replaced without further consideration. So we all know, a lot of us really personally, as has been talked about so far on this panel, how financially devastating COVID has been. And of course, we all know that for many, this has disrupted our ability to pay rent. And each one of us, if we're alone in this situation, is facing the very real and very scary risk of being taken to court by our landlords when the moratorium is over, and ultimately possibly being evicted or having rent money sent to collections, which all just ultimately perpetuates this cycle of financial strain for those of us who are already under the most extreme financial strain. And we can be really confident that landlords will retaliate when the eviction moratorium ends. So far, a lot of landlords have made very few concessions for their renters during this crisis. And when they have, it's really only been out of necessity. So for example, when tenants under Full-Time Management reached out to the management company about rent deferment or payment plans, the response from Full-Time Management was just to waive credit card fees. But of course, as we know, amassing huge credit card debt without any way to pay it off doesn't help us at all. So it was only when we started to actually withhold rent that they reached out to individual tenants to offer payment plans. And tenants have reported getting repeated calls and texts and emails about rent, even when they know that we don't have the money to pay. And this suggests that they are really ready to take whatever they can from us, regardless of the position that it's leaving us in. So this is why our tenant union and why tenant organizations in general are such crucial forces. As Andrea sort of mentioned, touched on earlier, the only way that we have any strength against large landlords like Full-Time Management is by banding together, and ultimately by using their own power against them. So the logic is sort of that if landlords can treat tenants as expendable because of how many pay rent to them each month, then by that same token, the more of us that band together, the harder it is for them to retaliate, because it's not in their best interest to evict half of their tenants, and it's really not realistic for them to do that. So Full-Time Tenant Union is building power in other ways than just rent striking too. We start at the ground level by talking to our neighbors. We're working with other groups like Crown Heights Tenant Union to organize banner drops and other socially distant actions that raise visibility for our demands. We're creating and distributing materials that help tenants understand why organizing is so crucial, and resources to report and deal with landlord harassment and to report unaddressed maintenance complaints and building violations. We're publicizing our actions on social media, which ensure that we as tenants assert our voice in the narrative of this crisis. We have legal counsel, and we are gathering legal information about our immediate and longer term concerns, which we're hoping to be able to disseminate on larger levels soon. And the exciting thing is that all of this organizing is starting to work. We're seeing some progress. So the way that Full-Time Management is reacting to our actions is telling us that they're getting nervous, that they're aware of the power that we're building. And it's working on a larger level too. As we know, Cuomo's extension of the eviction moratorium, even though it's sort of not the result that we want, but it's movement. And we know that that movement wasn't something that happened just out of his own benevolence because he wanted to. That only happened because we have been making noise as tenants, and that noise people are being forced to listen to. So ultimately, as a tenant union, Full-Time Tenant Union is echoing this question of why renters are forced to carry the financial burden of these massive landlords like Full-Time Management or like Blackstone, as has been mentioned. and why renters and small homeowners are forced to carry the financial burdens of corporate bailouts and big bank bailouts during this crisis. Why are we, as workers and tenants, being forced to go into debt, to drain our savings, to choose between rent and food, to risk eviction, just to make sure that those who have the far greater resources than us, than many of us will ever see in their lives even, just get to keep those resources to themselves instead of using them to help everybody else. So it's crystal clear to all of us that this is absolutely not right. And I really just want to underscore that we believe very firmly that the only way we can fight back against these injustices, drawing on historical movements and such, is by gathering strength in numbers and really working under the conviction that this crisis is not our fault and that we should not be the ones paying for it. Thanks.
Thank you, Ellen, so much. And just to keep things moving, I want to go on to our next speaker, Lena Melendez. Lena is a part of the Riverside Edgecombe Neighborhood Association. She is on rent strike, and she's a tenant organizer in Washington Heights. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lena. And then right after that, we're going to take on some of these questions that people have been putting in the chat, and also any other ones. So feel free to put those into the chat now, either on YouTube or on Facebook Live. Thanks, and here's Lena.
Thanks, Danny. All right, my name is Lena Melendez. I am a member of the Riverside Edgecombe Neighborhood Association, as Daniel said. I am also a part of the gig economy workers. I'm an Uber driver, and when this pandemic hit, the industry came like to a screeching halt. I decided not to work early on because if the governor was telling Uber drivers and everybody else to shelter in place and to socially distance, I can't do that in a vehicle. I can't do that in my vehicle. So I decided not to continue to work. And as an Uber driver, I'm not eligible for unemployment benefits. So, and you know, when I reached out to my neighbors, I'm the president of the tenant association in my building. I reached out to my neighbors. There were at least 5 out of 31 tenants that are undocumented. They are not they're not waiting for a stimulus check, an unemployment check, a welfare check, a social security check, or any other check. We were able to gather some funds from people that donated monies to give them money just for whatever they needed. My building is on rent strike, organized by RENA. 12 other buildings. We have 12 other buildings that we are working with. And we hold tenant association meetings once a week on Saturdays via Zoom. I was able to, early on, what I did was I created flyers to reach out to my neighbors to see who would be willing to, who can pay the rent, who'd be willing to join a rent strike who'd be willing to join a rent strike even if they could pay their rent and put their money on the side in solidarity with those who can't. Because gentrification has taken such a hold in Washington Heights, it's really just creeping more and more into every building. You see 2 and 3 market rate apartments where there used to be all rent regulated. We have the largest rent regulated stock of housing in Washington Heights. So the next step was we had RENA send a letter on their letterhead to our landlord stating that we are on rent strike. The landlord's response was to send informational flyers with the next rent statement, showing us how we could pay our rent, via online. So that was his response: pay your rent. This, despite mortgage moratorium that the governor put in place, despite the fact that they get tax breaks from the CARES Act, despite the PPP that they enjoyed to pay salaries for porters and superintendents, as well as the lowest oil prices we've seen since the 70s, which is tied to rent increases because of heating costs. We have been harassed. We have been told, we put banners up. May 1st, we did a banner drop. We were told to bring the banners down. And I have to say that it is mentally torturous for Cuomo to call for a temporary rent moratorium. It is woefully inadequate for tenants to sit and wait for the day that the landlords are just waiting to evict people. This has been their business plan for a while. I think since the gentrification really started to settle in. While Governor Cuomo kicks the can down the road, renters are worried and sleepless. We're not just sitting at home doing nothing, though. We are holding tenant association meetings. We're teaching tenants the difference between rent suspensions and cancellation forgiveness. We have secured free legal assistance for tenants to protect them from landlords' harassment and to protect them during after the rent moratorium is lifted. We've put our banners up again as our First Amendment rights protect. We plan to bring tenants from other buildings that our landlord owns into the fold. I really like that idea, Ellen. That's a very powerful idea, and I think that it's one that will have our landlords take a second and really listen to us. And to those who say it is impossible, I say when we fight, we win. We voted out 7 out of 9 IDC members who blocked our rent laws from passing for over 3 decades. We got the inward rezoning annulled. Okay, for those who say it is impossible, we got historic rents that we passed in 2019. Okay, we don't tell me it's not possible. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Lena and Ellen, really both excellent. Really talking about how to connect what's going on in your building to this broader project of building power and all of the things that New York renters have won before. So I want to make the most of our time with our top-notch panel that we have for questions and answers. So just again, we've had folks from Socialist Alternative, Democratic Socialists of America, Housing Justice for All, Met Council on Housing, Full-Time Tenants Union, Riverside Edge Cove Neighborhood Association, and Rent Strike 2020 all here. So I want to start with a question, maybe best for Stephen Latham from Socialist Alternative and Sia Weaver from Housing Justice for All Coalition. Sort of this big picture question about what strategy is needed to keep this movement growing and getting more powerful. What strategy will take us to victory? And a particular question from the comments, Stephen Molina asked, what role can labor unions, or maybe he's just thinking sort of outside of the box of the housing movement, but what can other parts, particularly the labor movement, play to help strengthen the housing movement, and what strategy will take us to victory? So why don't I hand it over to Sia? Maybe you could take like a minute or so to kind of get some ideas in there.
Sure. So I'll say a couple things. Also, I just want to shout out MARCELA, who is running for office right now. And so I just want to make sure that folks know that and can like volunteer and donate for her campaign, because it's really important that we elect socialists to office in Albany right now. So one major strategy to win is by electing people like MARCELA directly out of the tenant movement to Albany. Because like we're not gonna win unless we have like people who are our people, who know the fight inside and out, as MARCELA has laid out in Albany. So I would say a major strategy for us is that. And then I would say some other strategies. The strategy of the rent strike, something that's very, very, very important, is that like, you know, the government working under capitalism is working to protect real estate interests and private property. And we're trying to force something different. So by going on a rent strike, what we're doing is we're targeting real estate because we want real estate to, because we believe that like the housing crisis is so bad in this moment that something is going to happen one way or another. Right now, the government is moving to bail out the real estate industry. And we are trying to disrupt that. And we are trying to say, like, we want to create chaos for the real estate industry one way or another. And we want them to like call on the government to step in. And that is going to help us be able to negotiate and to be able to hold more control over our housing. The second thing, or the final thing I will say, is that it's really critical that we fight for reforms that actually take power away from landlords, which vouchers don't do. So by canceling rent, we're changing the relationship we have to where we live, and we're changing our relationship to our landlord, and that's really important.
Thanks, Sia. Great points. I want to turn it over to Stephen Latham from Socialist Alternative to also talk. Maybe you can address some of these questions about the labor movement too.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really great question from other Stephen. I want to look back to the historical record again, to the Great Depression, actually. This was a time that we, in all the textbooks, that what we all learned in school was that, like, something mystical and bad happened on Wall Street, and everything got really bad, and everybody was really poor. And then in swooped the Democratic president, FDR, and out of the goodness of his heart, he just handed out, because he was a good, social democratic leader, he just sort of gave away all the things that saved the country. But in fact, that's not how it happened at all. What happened was, after an initial stunning moment in which the working class was, obviously very stunned. A lot of people lost their jobs, lost their homes. For the first couple of years after the Depression, they then began to get organized. So we had not just tenant organizations forming, like we're talking about here today, but also we developed unemployed councils. So groups of unemployed people working together with socialists, with what at the time was called like the communist movement. So activists were involved in that process. And they were forming their own unions of unemployed people. And then apart from that, at the time, there weren't really strong labor unions operating outside of like the craft trades, or like the little bit more like the trades that were, we would consider today to be like sort of more like middle class jobs or whatever. And instead, we had a lot of workers in the auto industries and in factories who had no access to unions. And then by linking up through the socialist movement specifically, that was the space. That's what I was trying to talk about a little bit in my presentation here, was that through that space of the socialist movement, you could have all of these like isolated groups, atomized groups of like the tenants unions, the unemployed people's unions, and then the newly formed labor movement through the CIO, which had newly been born, were able to mount a massive pressure campaign to demand very specific things from FDR, from the government at that time, and they were able to win. So I think that is how we need to look at this moment as well. Link up. We have to link up, and we need a space in which to link up, and we think that a really good space to do that is through the Democratic Socialist of America, through Socialist Alternative.
Thanks. And with that, actually, let me turn to Marcela also to add in, because obviously as someone who's running in this environment for elective office as an open democratic socialist, it would be great to know what are some elements of your strategy for, for campaigning and for talking about housing with people in your community that you're looking to, give you their vote.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the campaign was going full swing, and then the pandemic came, and it was like having to put on the brakes. So trying to figure out how to adjust and pivot and how to keep moving forward. One of the great things was we had already built a infrastructure of volunteers, and we were able to transition into phone banking. So understanding how folks were already living paycheck to paycheck, and how housing has just become really unaffordable in a gentrifying community. We had the opportunity to reach out to folks and check in with them, but also kind of have these discussions about what they're dealing with, what how this is impacting them, but also really have conversations about the system and how government has failed us, and really this being opportunities to talk about how we can really make changes. And I think that through those conversations, understanding that someone who comes from the working class, who has these types of lived experiences, would be in a much better position to make decisions about legislation that's going to impact our communities for generation. And so connecting with voters on the disconnect that we currently have with the incumbent, understanding the changes that need to be made, and understanding our role, and in this opportunity. Sunset Park in the 51st Assembly District, which includes Red Hook, has one of the lowest turnouts for votes. And so aside from just talking about the campaign, this is a really great opportunity to build grassroots movement power and really bring the power back to the people, beyond a candidacy or a candidate.
Great. Thanks, Marcela. I think I want to turn to a question that was in the comments from Michelle Rafferty. Michelle is sort of pointing to this reality in New York that you have very small units, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 unit buildings that are excluded from rent stabilization and those strong rent stabilization laws that we've talked about. We also have huge buildings with hundreds of units, right? And everything in between in New York. And Michelle asked the question, what is considered a small landlord? And how do the Housing Justice for All movement demands sort of fit within that? How do we conceptualize them? Are they to be rescued too? Are they part of the problem? And to sort of take on that, I want to invite Andrea Shapiro to take that on and talk about how small landlords fit within this and what the demands of the movement are for small landlords.
Thanks. And so, yeah, there's a wide variety of housing in New York. And I also wanted to make sure that it's clear that cancel rent is for whether you're regulated or not. Anything from you rent a one family home, which some people do in New York City, but it's very common upstate, to 1,000 unit building. We need cancel rent to cover everybody because it doesn't matter when your building was built or how big it is, you can still be hit by this financial crisis. And so your rent needs to be canceled. And we really want to protect sort of the fabric of New York. We understand people like Sia's landlord who lives on the first floor. In past apartments, I've had landlords who lived across the street from me. Those are the people we need to protect. The people who are renting out, the top floor of their 2-family house, own one or, a handful of buildings in New York City. And that is what they do. They're paying a lot of attention to those tenants. They care a lot. And we know that they're actually better landlords. And we don't want to see those units to then be bought by Blackstone, by private equity companies after this crisis, because it's just easier. So we actually need to think about the landlords that help make up our neighborhoods. I know in 2008, during that financial crisis, my landlord lived across the street. We talked to him. We actually got a discount on rent, right? Because he could do that. He knew who we were. We knew who his children were. We knew who his father was. He was invested in us the same way that he was invested in his property. And so we need to actually pay attention to those landlords and not lose New York City to private equity, where we are just a number and an amount on a rent roll, and make sure that there's a fund that they can apply to. And they should be the ones applying because they are running a business to get money for relief.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrea. I want to turn to a question that Donald Birmingham asked in the chat. And I want to kind of point this maybe to Lena and Ellen, since you're on rent strikes. And there's this question from Donald. He says, isn't it wrong to take unemployment and not pay rent? And I think this kind of fits within a broader question about how much COVID-19 has opened up this box of worms, or can of worms, in terms of what are people's responsibilities when we were in a mass pandemic and there's mass unemployment, but there are some unemployment resources, or the $1,200 stimulus checks that some people got, but those are one time. So how do you kind of take this question of, is it wrong to take unemployment and not pay rent? Or maybe even linked to that, what are the broader goals? Is it really just about rent, or is there something else here that the movement is trying to get to? So let's bring in Ellen and then Lena to talk about that.
What comes to mind is the question of whether it's wrong for landlords to take PPP and to take tax breaks and to take, to try to raise rents. They're calling up our elected officials. Can we evict yet? Can we evict now? When can we evict? Is that not wrong? Everything always falls on the renter. When we are one paycheck, we're living from paycheck to paycheck, paycheck to paycheck. Whatever, the maximum that unemployment can give you is $504 a week. That is peanuts next to what these corporate landlords are getting. So I'm not crying a river for them.
Thanks, Lena. How about Ellen? Do you want to add on to that, or any reactions to what Lena said?
Yeah, completely second what Lena said. But also, I think it's important to recognize the reality that a lot of people who should be getting unemployment are not getting unemployment right now. That our unemployment system is totally unequipped to deal with this crisis, because it's not meant to deal with mass unemployment. So I think when we ask the question of if it's wrong to not pay rent when you're getting unemployment, we have to remember that there are a lot of people who are not getting unemployment who should be. And we really need to start there at a deeper level.
Thanks, Ellen.
Also, I just want to add that if you add all of the unemployment checks for the month, right, it's $2,000 for the month. Think about what your financial budget is on a monthly basis. Okay, rent for most what do you call those small 1-bedroom apartments, studio apartments? For a studio apartment, it's like $1,500. So now you're left with $500 to pay your cell phone bill, to pay all your other credit cards. I'm living on my credit cards right now. So, what they're giving people is just not enough to live on.
Thanks, Lena. And I think that points, we've seen so much demand for food banks, for emergency meals, for so many things in our communities, and mutual aid has sprung up as a necessary response to that. But obviously the government, particularly the federal government, has so many responsibilities that they've not, been able to deal with. And I think I kind of want to get into this question though a little bit more about, like, is this just about this immediate period, right? Because the governor has already talked about starting to reopen parts of New York that opened beginning yesterday, in less populated parts of New York. At some point, everybody, when you see people outside, people want to go back, to some semblance of normal activity. And I think the question is, can you put the toothpaste back in the tube though? Or are we in like a kind of brave new world here of what life looks like living with and under this pandemic, and how housing is related to that, I think is so interesting, right? Because without housing, how are you supposed to stay safe from, this virus? And I think it's a great example of housing as healthcare, housing as a human right, many things that we've spoken to. And with that, I kind of want to ask a question, whoever would like to kind of take this from the panel, but how do you envision using this housing, the COVID-19 crisis to change the housing market for the better? So if any of the panelists want to come in on that, feel free to just unmute yourself.
I can answer that if you want.
Thanks, Sia.
So we're going into a period, whether or not rent is canceled, of prolonged distress in the real estate market that was already starting thanks to the rent laws that we won. And that's a good thing, because our housing market was so inflated because people were speculating on displacement and evictions and like an unnatural amount of profit. So in this moment, when real estate companies are walking away from housing, which is what I think we can all expect to happen, it's really critical that we have options for municipal ownership and we have options for community land trusts, shared equity, and other collective controls over our housing market. That's going to require a deep amount of public investment, but we already have the tools in New York. We have a long history of limited equity cooperatives in New York. We've retained our public housing when many other cities have lost it. And so we are well set up to like really make that difference right now. We just need to have the political will to act. But the choices for me right now is the housing market is going into distress. So there are two options. One is Blackstone buys everything, or two, the community is able to take control. And I really hope that it is the former or the latter. I'm not sure what former or latter is. I really hope that we can win.
Brilliant. Great points there. So yeah, especially around, I think that's something that sometimes, you know, depending on everyone's particular housing situation, the fact that we do have this history of as you say, limited equity co-ops, of municipal or public ownership, right? And, you know, I want to kind of turn to Stephen to talk a little bit about, I know Socialist Alternative has a campaign to tax Amazon and for use the proceeds from taxing the biggest businesses in Seattle to build social housing. Maybe you want to expand on that a little bit about how Socialist Alternative across the country is looking to use this crisis to change the housing market for the better. Stephen?
Yeah, sure. As devastating as this is for so many people, so many individuals, you know, probably all of us as well. I'm on unemployment right now. It is also, I think, as Sia and other people are pointing to, it is also an opportunity. And it's also like an incredible victory that we were able to, that this movement, Housing Justice for All, was able to push for having moratorium stretched out until August. And that is expanding this window in which we have more time now to build these movements that we're talking about. Back to the Tax Amazon campaign. This is something that we've been doing out of Councillor Shama Sawant's office there. We proposed a very, very modest tax actually on Amazon a couple of years ago, something to the tune of like $47 million that we're hoping would be funneled into public housing and affordable housing in that city, which is undergoing like a housing crisis that is as bad or not, if not worse than even what we see in New York, where we have over the past 2 years, the homelessness rate has gone from 60,000 homeless people up to 90,000. These are people who are just counted, right? It's actually much worse than that. This is like beyond Great Depression levels at this point. So anyway, we're trying to do the same thing a couple of years ago in Seattle. We pushed for it, built a movement for it, and we ultimately did get the entire city council to vote in favor of this incredible measure that still would have been kind of like pennies. This is nothing. This is 0.01% of the profits of Amazon in Seattle. However, in Seattle, Amazon funneled millions and millions of dollars, more money than they would have been taxed from, to launch a campaign against this Amazon tax. They had hired their own door knockers to compel people to pressure their officials not to vote for it. And so it ended up getting repealed. Well, Shama just got reelected, and the very first thing that we did was put this tax back on the agenda. And now that COVID has happened, that has changed what the demands around the Amazon tax should be. And so now we're trying to win money in order to help working people in this crisis. And these are things that we can begin to do in other places with other businesses here in New York. But again, we have to start uniting these movements.
Thanks, and let me bring Marcela in as well. Obviously, as a woman running for elective office in New York for the New York State Assembly, tell us a little bit more about your vision about how we take this crisis that we're in, and what type of political action should we be taking, either as citizens or as tenants, and what vision do you have at the end goal for how we can come out of this crisis with more rights, not fewer?
Can you hear me? Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think that what we're trying to build is, this working class movement, this working class power. And it starts with us as individuals and understanding that we as individuals have power ourselves and what it means when we come together. It's important to use the victories to really demonstrate what's possible. For a really long time, it feels like we have been conditioned to think a certain way. But we need to start pushing back on that. And I think that one of the great opportunities that running for state assembly has given me is to really just have those conversations and connect with people. When you start talking about their individual issues and how it's connected to something larger, you start getting into the ways that we can actively participate to make those changes, right? Whether it's getting more civically engaged and understanding the importance that our votes our votes have, and really working with our neighbors in our community, building that collective power, um, and really understanding that we as individuals with lived experiences are really the ones that have the answers, and that's what should be leading the changes. Because what we don't want is a little bit of what we spoke, right? We don't want corporations getting the chunk of the pie because they're at the table. We need to make sure that we're there too. And we need to understand that that happens when we become involved. And part of that is the empowerment that we give ourselves as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Marcela. Now, our final question, I want to bring in Andrea and Lena and Ellen to ask this. And I think it's been on everyone's mind. And I know that, the Housing Justice for All Coalition, in the New York Times, there are photos of strikes happening, rent strikes happening on May 1st. So I want to ask a question about what tactics are working for tenant organizing in the age of social distancing? And do you see safe ways to protest in the traditional ways of the workers and tenants movement, despite the challenges of COVID-19? So whoever of Andrea and Lena and Ellen wants to jump in on that, feel free to unmute and go for it.
So I can start us off. And I think what Lena explained earlier about how she's been organizing her building is really great ways of like how we organize in this time. Doing more banner drops, more signs in our windows. It needs to be something that everyone sees as much as it's actually happening, because that's the only way we can actually get our message across. On May 22nd, we are doing a social distance protest. So a protest where we are asking people to come with their masks on, stay at an appropriate distance apart, and travel there safely at Blackstone's office, which is in Midtown. We're seeing that happen in other cities, and we're going to do one here. We've also been doing car protests. So people who have cars come out, make lots of noise from their cars, have signs, and sort of do caravans. We did one in front of the governor's office in Midtown to Times Square. And then we also did one up in Albany, which has been really exciting.
Awesome. Lena?
I don't know how much more I can add to that other than, we bang our pots outside the window on Fridays at 2:00. And, we yell out our windows, rent strike, putting up a sign on my door to my apartment on rent strike, just to be visible.
Great. And Ellen?
Yeah, definitely seconding everything that Andrea and Lena said. And also I think like one thing that Full-Time Tenant Union is really trying to do is amass and compile just as much information, as many sort of resources as we can to help spread information to people who, are maybe sort of on the edge of being on board with our movement. So that's another thing that we can do while social distancing.
Awesome. Thank you. So we are actually at time for this event. At the beginning, I said I was hoping people would take, 3 things out of it to connect more deeply to the organizations that are really driving this housing movement forward. in New York. And I want to shout those out again: Socialist Alternative, Democratic Socialists of America, the Housing Justice for All Coalition, Met Council on Housing, Full-Time Tenants Union, Riverside Edgecombe Neighborhood Association, and Rent Strike 2020. Please check in the comments. We'll be putting more resources there. Secondly, I hope you got something out of discussing what strategy this movement is going to take going forward, and you thought critically about the differences between a voucher option, between universal cancellation of rent, the different options out there. And then finally, hopefully take away some of the resources and the calls to action that we have. And to that end, there's a can't pay pledge. I think Sia talked about a number of these, and as well as all the panelists actually. Can't pay pledge, the petition to Andrew Cuomo, which has something like 100,000 signatures or maybe more across a variety of petitions. You can call your Congress member to support Representative Ilhan Omar's bill on people's action, and we can put that link into the chat. Of course, follow these groups on social media to keep in touch with them. I know Met Council has Monday night calls for rent strike support. You can find out more on the Met Council website and in their social media. Those are at 6:30 p.m. on Monday nights. Socialist Alternative has some follow-up meetings looking at, a universal rent control was one of Bernie Sanders' key demands. How does that demand live on after Bernie? And so Beyond Bernie meetings are going to be held, hosted by Socialist Alternative on May 23rd. Those are scheduled from 2 to 4 p.m. if you live in the borough of Queens, 6 to 8 p.m. if you live in the borough of Brooklyn. But feel free, if you live in another borough or one of those times doesn't work for you, on May 23rd to join whichever meeting you can. You can also text Met Council if you're on rent strike, and please do, because an important part of this meeting is to bring all of us together and to integrate our forces into the strongest united front that we can in order to succeed. So please do text Met Council if you haven't and you're on rent strike. We'll be putting up the number in just a moment, but it's 646-542-1920, and you can write rent strike or huelga de renta when you send your text message to 646-542-1920. So with that, I'm Dan KROOP. I want to thank Andrea, Sia, Ellen, Lena, Marcela, Stephen, as well as Molly, Gabe, Paul, Brian, Kyle, and everybody who helped produce all the back end and all the technology for this. I think has been a great discussion, and I'm really looking forward to our movement just continuing to go. You get stronger and stronger. June 1 will be a big date, but of course, as you heard, on May 22nd, there's going to be more actions that we can take visually to strengthen our movement. With that, thanks again to all the panelists. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Stay safe out there and take care. And when we fight, we win. So let's fight. Thanks and bye-bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.